today and tomorrow. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Craig Wilkins. I'm the Chief Executive of the Conservation Council of South Australia, your proud host tonight of this Space for Joinery and our Nature and Climate Forum. But we are not alone in terms of this event. We are part of an alliance of 24 groups from the nature and climate space who have banded together to talk to our politicians about what we want on behalf of the environment in the next 4 years of government. So there's been a series of forums. This is number 6, I think. We've done, most of them have been online in key electorates. We've had a formal election survey and various lobbying and advocacy to try and influence decision making. And the reason is because South Australia has a proud state, a proud history as a visionary, inclusive and forward-thinking state. We've done some great work around things like container deposit legislation, protection of marine parks, and of course we are showing the world the way to transition from fossil fuels towards a renewable energy future dominated by wind and solar. So we've got some great stories to tell, but we've also got a lot of challenges, and we need to make sure that any future government and parliament, including the upper house, really stands up for the issues we care about. Tonight, we are delighted to have Susan Close, Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, and Robert Sims, who's the lead candidate for the Australian Greens and is a current Legislative Councillor. We also invited Minister David Spears, and as of 7:10, he has not turned up, which we think is a real shame. To be fair, this government actually has some good stories to tell around things like single-use plastics, increases in protected area, and continuing the previous government's energy transformation. So there's some good things that could be talked about, but he's not here to say those stories. Instead, we get a chance to speak to two, I think, super impressive members of Parliament, and we really appreciate you coming along tonight. So in terms of the format, I'm going to ask them both to do a brief introductory statement, just giving an overview of what they'd like to achieve. Then we've had a series of questions come through from our sector and from our alliance partners, and we've been inundated with questions. I've got 7 pages, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all of them tonight, unless you're very, very succinct. Yeah, we've got lots of questions to get through. I'll pick out some of the key ones, but I apologise in advance if I don't get to everyone's questions. Then we'll open up to you, the audience, to ask questions. And so we'd like you, if you'd like to ask a question, when I give you the word, there's a microphone set up over there, and if you'd like to wander across, and then we can go through in order of people who would like to ask a question. So we've got about an hour and a half. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can, and if time allows, we'll have a short concluding statement as well from our 2 guests. I reckon that's where we're at. So I think we should start. So perhaps I'll ask you, Robert, to begin with. Just a few moments to describe what you'd like to achieve if you are re-elected come March 19.
Thanks very much, Craig, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. It's really great to be out of the Zoom room and to be actually able to having face-to-face events like this. And good to be here with Susan Close as well. We've become a bit of a double act doing a few of these forums together, and it is disappointing to see that the Liberals haven't sent somebody along, because I think it would be good to be able to have a bit of a debate and discussion. In terms of the role of the Greens this election, we are not going to be forming the next government of South Australia, but we are going to be playing a vital role in the upper house, and we're seeking to win the balance of power in our own right in the states upper house for the first time. Something we've been wanting to do for years, and this election we think we've got an opportunity to achieve that. What that means is that whether the Labor Party or the Liberal Party form government, we'll be able to play a role in terms of holding them to account and making sure that the environment and climate has a key priority. And certainly it's my hope that Susan Close becomes the next Environment Minister. I think she'd be fantastic in that role, but I also recognise that not everybody in the Labor Party is like Susan Close, and it's very important to have the Greens in the upper house to keep the Labor Party to task and to ensure that they deliver on their environmental commitments. In terms of the sorts of issues that we want to focus on in the Greens, we recognise, of course, that renewable energy is vital for us in terms of dealing with the climate crisis. And we're campaigning this election for a publicly owned renewable energy provider with a big focus on low-income homes, low-income families, and ensuring that they've got access to solar and wind and renewables. We're also the only party that has a real plan in terms of reducing emissions through our transport system. We want to make public transport free. It's something we can do by making sure that developers pay their fair share of tax, and it's an easy thing that the government could do that would, I think, reduce congestion and reduce carbon emissions. We're also campaigning for the next government to have a big focus on cycling infrastructure. This has been totally neglected by both of the major parties over many years. We need to have a separated cycling infrastructure throughout SA, and we're calling for the next government to put $20 million on the table to make that happen. So we have an integrated, separated bike network throughout our state. In terms of other priorities for us, significant trees and the protection of those is a matter that's going to be a priority. I know that the Labor Party have said that they're keen to look at that as well, and I'd be very keen to work with them in the next Parliament to achieve that. But we also need to ensure that we're planting more trees, and we've got an urban greening project that we're campaigning for this election with a focus on planting 2 million trees across the state. And finally, we have to protect our existing green space, and we're campaigning to heritage list the parklands to get that happening, but also to ensure that we don't see the continuing erosion and commercial development of our public green space, and we'll certainly be holding the Labor and Liberal parties to account for their plans to commercialise that space. So that's a bit of a snapshot of some of the things that are in our focus. There are many more issues, of course, that are key for environment and climate policy. I look forward to being able to talk a bit more about those.
I've just been at the debate between the Premier and my leader, Peter Malinauskas, at the Press Club today, and the opening statement makes you think of a debate, whereas this isn't actually a debate. We're not identical by any means, but we're not in competition either. And I really like Rob. But also, as we all do, I think, but also we're both committed to a better and healthier and sustainable environment. We have chosen slightly different paths. And in fact, if you think about the three of us, you've chosen activism, and you've chosen a minor party where you can really thump hard, and I've chosen, since the age of 15, a major party that I want to make better and greener, but that I need to be in government to do anything. So I think the difference in emphasis we're likely to see comes from those different places. So if I just try to go for three big issues or categories of issue as an opening statement. The first is nature. I have been disturbed. I mean, we know that we've got an extinction crisis, and we know that it exists independently of climate change, but we also know that it's made worse by climate change, and it's also not talked about as much, at least in part because climate change absorbs so much of people's understanding. I've been concerned that a lot of the focus of discussion about the environment in the last 4 years has been seen through a tourism and recreation lens. Now, that is not to say that I don't see immense value in people being out in nature, enjoying nature, and therefore, in many ways, becoming an advocate for nature. What I would say, though, is it's not the same as protecting and restoring nature. And so I have a number of policies that I'm really keen to implement that are much more about protecting and restoring biodiversity. Money into heritage agreements, for example, money into land care to support their work, money into Friends of Parks to support the work that they do. So money into science inside the Environment Department, with a particular focus both on citizen science on the one hand and also restoring the biodiversity of the Mount Lofty Ranges after the extraordinary 20-year work done by the Nature Conservation Society on the loss of birds through, as an indicator species, on the loss of birds through that biodiversity hotspot. Protected areas, making sure that we are in fact getting closer to CARS, Comprehensive Adequate and Representative System, and that we are able to protect some iconic areas, such as going for World Heritage for the Bight, for example. The second category I want to talk about is community engagement or community sentiment. I've just come from a group of incredibly angry residents in West Lakes because their local council wants to get rid of, or possibly simply dramatically alter, a quite large freshwater lake that exists on Delphin Island. Artificial lake, sure, I mean the whole of West Lakes is a former drowned area, right? But it's become home to long-necked turtles, apart from anything else. And when I was down at Clayton Bay on the weekend with the Corongo Lakes Action Group, we had a fantastic presentation from the, I was going to say NRM board, the landscape board down there, talking about the importance of the turtles in the river, including long-necked turtles, and how dreadfully rare they are. So here we've got a little oasis, and the council wants to drain it. So those residents are furious. They are just the last, because I just came from there, of a long list of groups who are standing up for their local environment. It might be people opposing soccer pitches put on in Belair. It might be the Friends of Flinders Chase, who, as I understand it, are still on strike over the way in which that development was treated, and the regulation that was put in to simply facilitate it, to bypass the normal native vegetation clearance processes. The people in McLaren Vale who didn't want to see a PFAS dump next to an incredibly important biodiversity and primary production region. And what I cannot stand is the way that people are accused of NIMBYism, because if you don't care for the environment immediately in front of you, how are you going to care for the planet? So why oughtn't we respect? And what I've seen out of this government has been a series of, it's all going to be great, we're going to listen to you, you're saying what I don't like, so I'm not talking to you anymore. And that must stop, because we may have disagreements, but we are all part of a movement that actually cares, and we ought to be encouraged to do that, not disrespected for it. The third category is, of course, climate change, and usually one would start with climate change, but I wanted to get the other two off my chest. And we have a very ambitious plan that's constantly under attack from the government, but an ambitious plan to have a hydrogen plant, which really is the next piece in the renewable energy puzzle for South Australia. We have got such extraordinary assets here. It's windy and it's sunny. Apparently it's one of the places in the world that has most of that concomitant wind and sun. And so we have the capacity to produce far more energy than we can use. So what we need is a way to store it, feed it back in, and be able to stabilise, have that baseload power that firms up renewable. So that is the centrepiece of our climate change policy, and I'm sure we'll get to other ones as we talk about it. It's so exciting, publicly owned, so I get a tick from Rob for that, and exactly where we need to be if we're going to make this not just an environmental issue, but about how we have a new economy that is based on zero carbon. And to do that, we need to be able to make things using green energy. And having that capacity to firm will do that. Because I've always been driven crazy by this idea that it's an environmental issue, as if that's somehow then able to be played off. I've hated so much that Venn diagram of environment, society, and economy, as if they're three separate things that kind of just have a bit of an overlap. What we have is a planet, we have the environment, and inside that we have human society, and one of the ways we choose to organise ourselves is that we have an economy. They're all dependent on the environment. And if we ignore that in the next 5 years, 10 years, then we have no chance, not only because climate change will become completely uncontrollable, but because if other parts of the world are moving the way we want them to, we're going to be left behind. So that's where we are on that policy, and I'll be quiet because I'm not timing myself. I suspect that was a bit long. Sorry.
Thank you to you both. Yeah, not surprisingly, the first sort of theme I'm keen to explore is climate. And it's great that we actually don't need to ask about. In fact, there was a series of questions about, do you accept the science of climate change? And it's reassuring to know we don't need to have
that one off the table.
Exactly. But we want to talk about how we get there. And certainly, when it comes to the energy equation, as we said before, and it's been mentioned a number of times tonight, we have a fantastic story around renewable energy. But when it comes to energy, there are two sides of the ledger. So we're promoting and celebrating the good stuff, but we also need to stop the bad stuff. And that, unfortunately, is where we aren't doing so well. And in fact, there's still an expansion of fossil fuel exploration and activity in South Australia at a time when the International Energy Agency is saying that we have to stop. So keen to get your response, Susan, to that sort of idea that it feels like Labor is still very committed to expanding gas at a time when we think it should stop. What's your thoughts around that? And perhaps also, while we're talking about gas, there's also the proposal for underground coal gasification at Leigh Creek, which is still being progressed despite the adamant opposition from the Andamutna people, and the fact that it was banned in Queensland for its horrific impact in terms of groundwater. Yeah, very keen to get a sense of what Labor's plan is for gas in the next term of government.
Yeah, I'm glad you've started with probably the hardest one for me to talk about, right? Because everyone in this room would say, I imagine, we should just stop exploring, we should stop producing, just turn it all off, because we can't release any more carbon than we are. The difficulty for that is that the way that our economy is established makes it almost impossible to simply stop, right? There's so much inertia in the system in the way that we're structured now, that simply saying we're going to forget sovereign risk, we're just going to turn everything off, stop everything, isn't within the realm of practical politics. We would not win an election if we said we were going to stop everything. And if we don't win an election, we can do nothing, because we're not the Greens, we're not there just, I don't mean just, but we're not there to add value to the debate and to use every part of your voting power in the upper house to change things. Labor is there to govern. So we are immediately in the realm of what is practical and what is possible. Now, climate change is real, and the world knows that it's real, and the market for fossil fuels is going. So that will happen, and what we need to do is be about adjustment. So rather than, will you ban, you haven't suggested that, but rather than will you ban all gas exploration or all gas extraction, what we have to do is prepare an economy for when no one wants gas. And it's a version of what happens in the eastern states with what happens when no one wants coal. However, there are some examples that are on the edge where you go, we just can't support that. So we have decided to support the ongoing moratorium on fracking in the southeast, for example. So we accept that relationship between that activity and the way in which that land is used and enjoyed is incompatible. We are going for World Heritage status for the Bight, and I personally was very pleased to see the end of the latest company, I can't remember, it was the Norwegian company, wanting to explore there. I am very concerned about they set it on fire, don't they, the Leigh Creek proposition. And the Andamutna being opposed is a separate and additional reason to be very concerned about that. I don't know what stage it's at in approval processes, I don't know what the legals are behind it, but it is one that concerned me when it was first being mooted towards the end of our time in government. I wasn't in this portfolio, but I heard about it and it seemed like a concerning thing to do. And I will certainly be paying very close attention to what can be done. But as I say, I think the responsibility of a state government is to prepare its economy and therefore the people whose livelihoods depend on how our economy functions for being low to zero carbon. And I think, although we did a lot better than the Liberals, I suspect one of the reasons in your stars we didn't go higher was because you'd like us to do more of the just stop it, and that's not what we were able to do. Yeah. Do you want to go on out green?
It's not going to surprise you to hear that I'm in the camp of saying, let's stop it. I guess for us in the Greens, we see gas as being the new coal, and we're very concerned about the impact of that. And the reality is South Australia's done some really good work over many years in renewables, but we've got to move away from the gas industry. There's lots of tangible things that we can do in the short term. One of the things that I must admit I found quite curious when I stepped into the state parliament was I learned that here in South Australia, when you purchase a home off the plan, the developer determines what energy source you have. So it's the developer who determines whether or not you're connected to gas or electricity. Which means, of course, people can purchase a home off the plan and be locked into gas, and we know that means higher energy prices, but also a more adverse environmental impact. So one of the things that we've done is introduced a private members bill to say, well, it's the consumer who should be able to make that choice, not the developer. And the Labor Party supported that in the upper house, and we welcome that, and certainly that's an issue I'm keen to pursue in the next government. That's a small thing, but it's something that would have an impact. But I also think we have to actually move towards denying these gas companies their social licence and move away from this narrative that they're essential to our economy here in South Australia. I mean, it's a real travesty to me that we have Santos as a fossil fuel company sponsoring the Tour Down Under, a cycling festival. I mean, it's pretty outrageous that we have a festival that's meant to be about showcasing South Australia's clean, green credentials being associated with a fossil fuel company. So these gas companies, fossil fuel companies, have ingratiated themselves with the two major political parties and with governments of all persuasions. I think we do need to break that link. In terms of fracking, we're absolutely against that, and my predecessor, Mark Parnell, was a big campaigner for that. So absolutely, moving away from the gas industry is going to be a key priority for us. We have to do that in terms of dealing with the climate crisis.
Yeah, no, thank you. We actually do recognise the sovereign risk issues because they are genuine. When you've got, and there's been a history of companies that have sued the state government here when their resource projects have stopped. So absolutely accept that. I think what we're looking for is some clear signalling around the future. And at the moment, it feels like, if anything, the Labor Party is probably even more pro-gas than the Liberal Party is in terms of some of their public positioning at times. So we are really keen for that. Around underground coal gasification, just to clarify, it is still definitely being, the approval process is rolling on. Most recently, the Premier, who is the Aboriginal Heritage Minister, actually delegated to Rob Lucas to approve the Aboriginal Heritage Act component of the approval process, and that's been granted. And so the company is still progressing through the system, even though they're yet to prove commerciality. So really encourage you to watch closely that one because that is still rolling on. And it's wonderful that both of you have talked about the World Heritage Protection for the Great Australian Bight. Even today in the Australian, I'm not sure if you saw, but you've had Keith Pitt and Tony Passon talking up the need to have oil and gas drilling in the Bight as a response to the Ukraine situation and high petrol prices. So classic.
I do love hot air, Craig.
Yeah.
Not
True.
surprising.
But I suppose there's a real sense of that Naomi Klein shock doctrine, disaster capitalism. Let's use the excuse of a peace issue to then drive something which is destructive for the environment. Let's go on to still with the climate theme, but on to other issues. And we've certainly, as a sector, been very keen to position the protection of big trees as a climate resilience issue and a climate preparation issue, because we know it is such an effective air conditioner for our cities. We welcome both of your commitments to looking at law reform, because our assessment over the last couple of years is that we aren't tracking well compared to other places, and as a result, we are losing many trees that we should be saving. Really keen to get some practical details about what that law reform could look like, because some of those gaps are things like allowing the Transport Department to not go through the usual planning approvals that everyone else has to go through. Or, classic example is in terms of comparison, we start kicking in our protections when it's 2 metres in circumference of the size of a tree. Some councils in Sydney and Melbourne kick in at 7.5 centimetres, others at 15 centimetres. They protect tiny trees compared to what we protect. As a result, we're so far behind. So really keen to get a sense of what practical measures you are looking at when it comes to law reform. So I'll start with Susan and then Robert.
Thank you. Yeah, I was so impressed with that series of reports that you've had oversight of. I think it's been contributed significantly to by a number of people, including Tom Morrison.
And Joanna in the room and others.
And Joanna, yeah. So very impressive and detailed work, and it drew my attention to some comparisons with other states that I hadn't appreciated. So it's very useful. And I'm not going to give you the specifics of what it's going to look like, because I think what's important is that we have a proper process to do that. One of the reasons I wanted our policy to be, we'll be the best in Australia rather than the worst, which I think is the reading from your reports, was that we have the ambition to improve our tree canopy, both through protection and through planting, and what kind of planting. But from opposition to start talking about tree circumferences and the impact and so on of that is very difficult. I've been wary from opposition of presuming too much detailed knowledge. I think it's important that we allow the process to go through properly. I know that the Planning Commission at the moment has some review underway, but it hasn't yet started that comparative review. So that presumably could be woven into the process that we will put in place. I think it is important that the community come along on this. I think your work's done that significantly, because it's lifted the baseline knowledge, your work through you, these other incredible people as well. But I think that's going to be very important, that we share an understanding. I'll tell you, as a constituency politician, I will get across Adelaide people who are very concerned about losing green spaces and losing canopy. But I will also get many people who love trees but don't want that one. That one's got to go because it's causing a problem. So I think it's really important that we not sort of that we not have a tree war, but that we try to bring along a shared understanding of what the amenity outcomes are, what the capacity still for us to accommodate a growing population in Adelaide, how that works and works well. And one of the other policies that I don't think has had very much attention is that we will set aside 10% of the developer contributions to the Planning and Development Fund. So that's when you do a development and you don't have 12.5% of green space, of open space, you put in the equivalent money into this fund, and then there's a open space program, grants program that puts money out. This is all in the planning portfolio, by the way, but it's all environmental. And last year that was reported, only I think a bit under 1% of that fund was expended on buying new land for councils. The rest, and it's good to upgrade existing land, but they weren't sort of adding to the space available. And so we've said 10% will be allocated available for councils to say, well, when that large house is up for sale, we'll actually buy it, turn it into a pocket park, so that the 2-for-1s around it are compensated for. and there's a place that's got the stormwater can run through. There's trees to provide shade and cooling, and there might be a little playground in the corner for the kids. So that's one of the policies that I'm actually really excited about, but hasn't made its way through very much, given the very legitimate noise about the health crisis. So I think that would get us some way as well, alongside having much, much better tree regulations for protection and for planting.
Like Susan, I do want to acknowledge the work that's been done in terms of getting this on the agenda in the election, and I read that report with interest that came out the other day. And I do agree that we need to look at best practice interstate. The reality is South Australia has the weakest protections in terms of significant trees at the moment. So anything we do will be an improvement on what is in place, but we do need to look at what is best practice. In terms of the wish list for the Greens and the kinds of things that we would be pushing for inclusion in any legislation, one of those that's really important for us is community appeal rights. And I think we've seen this issue recently with the trees on Frome Road that Renewal SA are trying to cut down. These are plane trees that have survived 2 world wars, they've survived the pandemic, and they're being cut down on the basis of what actually seems to be pretty flimsy evidence. Renewal SA are arguing that there are access issues and these can't be overcome, and so these majestic trees need to be knocked down. Now, members of the community, us collectively, have no standing in that process. We're not able to make an appeal and say, well, hang on, these trees are on public land, they belong to us all. We don't have any standing. So that's something that I think we need to change the law to reflect, so that we can actually, as a community, step in to speak out to protect those trees. So that's one thing. The other issue that we have here in South Australia is that if a developer is wanting to pursue a project, they can in effect have the trees cut down first, and then the project may not even go ahead because they're done in 2 separate processes. That seems to me to be complete lunacy. So we're actually allowing developers to chop down trees, and then we have land sitting there vacant with tumbleweeds blowing through. I mean, that is insanity. So we have to correct that. And we also need to have some very, very clear targets and expectations for developers around greening and ensuring that that's part of any new builds. So they're just some of the things that we would be keen to look at, not to mention protection for trees that are of cultural and environmental significance and that the community needs to see protected. And real targets around new construction, we don't construct trees, plant trees. We can do a lot of things with science, constructing trees, not there yet, but planting more trees. I guess the other point I'd make is around our planning system. We are very concerned about the way in which our planning system works in practice. The fact that this has been a system that is so heavily weighted in favour of the development sector, the big end of town, at the expense of the community. And so fundamental for us is bringing the community back into the planning process and ensuring that the community has a say on the kind of neighbourhoods that they want to live in. And that means, of course, giving the community a say around green space and the future of that too.
Thank you. And in fact, that was going to be the next question, was around the planning design code. So thank you for answering your question already. But I will put it to Susan. There's been, I think, some welcome commitments to have a look at the planning design code. There's a lot of concern amongst our sector around water, biodiversity, climate change, community access and rights, disaster preparation. The list goes on and on and on. There's been some really, I think, some welcome recognition from Labor around the need for reform. But it's interesting that language of reform has also been used to the property industry as well, which does raise alarm bells at the same time. So, because a review could actually mean changes which are in the wrong direction. So, I suppose what we're after some reassurance that any review of a planning design code is looking at those areas around climate, water, biodiversity, and community access, and heritage, of course.
Yes. Yes. So we have committed to an implementation review. And in that planning policy, there are a number of criteria that are identified as being of particular interest, including tree canopy. And think it is understandable that there would be questions, but I'm hopeful that, partly because I know who's involved around the table and what their views are, but also actually because I think the people of South Australia, the people of Adelaide, are really not going to tolerate much more of the kind of nonsense they've seen recently with planning. So I think that people power will be very helpful in making sure that we do have developments, and we do have a very gently but nonetheless growing population that we need to accommodate, and ideally not simply by making Adelaide larger and larger. So we do need to work out how to do that well. But I think people's reaction to the two-for-ones, so the big developers are one issue, and then the mother and father sell their house, the old trope, but the two-for-ones or the three-for-ones is also of significant concern for a lot of people. And the design that changes at that point. So I think those criteria will serve the interests that you've raised well. Yeah.
Can I just add, I mean, we welcome the fact there's going to be a review, that's great. But, the reality is both of the major parties do have form when it comes to setting up this planning system. It has been a two-party project over many years. And so for us, it's really important that in any review, we ensure we don't go backwards. We want to ensure there are genuine improvements, and we'll be fighting very hard to make sure that we really reverse what has been, I think, an incredibly unfair planning regime, and one that has shut out the community from decision-making processes, and that has put all of the power in the hands of those that have a vested interest. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we'll certainly be pushing to ensure that out of the review comes some real tangible changes. But we do welcome the fact that there's a commitment to review it and improve things.
Right, thank you. Now I'd love to talk about biodiversity and nature protection, and it is welcome, Susan, that you mentioned that as one of your key priorities at the start of tonight, because it's certainly a big concern for many people in the room. And we are really intrigued by the series of announcements that Labor have made around the biodiversity unit and the potential for a Biodiversity Act or other changes which could actually shape a lot of policy into the future. So really keen to get a stronger sense of what would a biodiversity unit do, what shift you'd like to create, and get a sense of, I suppose, the resources behind that, because I think it's fair to say when Labor was last in government, the last few years there was a real stripping out of the Environment Department, and a lot of good science was lost during that time. So really keen to get a sense of what the investment story is back in to build up the capacity of the Environment Department and the NGO sector to ensure that we can respond to the biodiversity crisis.
So if I just add some dollar figures to the announcements I mentioned earlier, so all of these are over the 4 years, $1 million additional for the Conservation Council and $1 million for Land Care Association of South Australia, 6 million for heritage agreements, 3 million for the biodiversity unit, including within that $1 million to be devoted to work on the Mount Lofty Ranges, 2 million for a citizen science effort fund based in the department, but obviously working in with the Landscape Board as well, which does a lot of citizen science, I know, but I want to sort of connect them up better. 3 million for Friends of Parks work. So I am very conscious of the lack of resources in the Environment Department. I'm also conscious that if the Minister were here, he would say that he's poured money back in. It seems to me the money is largely in infrastructure for people to enjoy parks, which, as I say, is terrific in very many ways, but isn't quite the same as what I'm proposing. So perhaps between them they complement each other. So I take your point. In terms of the actual work, I've put a Biodiversity Act in. Obviously, it partly depends on what happens in the upper house. because no major party controls the upper house, has it for a very, very long time. So the last thing we want to do is to open up environment legislation and make things worse. But the proposition is that we look carefully at biodiversity acts elsewhere and see if there's an integrating act that sort of deals with some of the ongoing challenges for native vegetation, looks at the National Parks and Wildlife Act, which is sort of an odd co-joined twin of an act, because it's about national parks and then it's about wildlife, but it's only about individual species, it's not about ecosystems. And then there's the Landscapes Bill, which is the replacement for the NRM, which Mark Parnell and I, before you came in, were able to shove a whole lot of nature back into it because it didn't appear in the draft that we saw. And in fact, with some very good lobbying from you guys and from the Alliance. But in itself, it isn't really designed to be about biodiversity because it's about natural resource management, even though it's got a different name. So what I think there is a gap for that piece of legislation that is about how do we actively protect and actively restore biodiversity, because both are required. The detail of that, again, I want to lean a little bit on process. I want this discussion, if I were Minister, and, Patrick O'Connor, I'd love to get, and he can give us all a lecture about how we could do biodiversity a whole lot better, amongst other people. So that there's a gap and it needs to be filled. It needs to be in full recognition of the extinction crisis that is experienced in South Australia as much, if not more, than most places in the world, and the pressure that climate change puts on that, and the pressure that our land use puts on that, and see if we can bring together something that really works well. I think the New South Wales Act is interesting, but unfortunately it does seem to have facilitated rather a lot of clearance. Now, I don't know how much that's the fault of the legislation and how much that's the way that the New South Wales government has used it, but the conceit of the New South Wales Act is a good one. It just has caused some but so we together we can do a bit of work on this, is my view, and our friends in the upper house will help us land it, as long as One Nation does not get that last spot, guys.
Is that right?
Hey, anything's possible in politics. Do you remember the Trump election?
Yeah, look, I think it's really great that the Labor Party want to deal with this if in government, and look, certainly for us, if we're in the balanced power in the upper house, we'd certainly be working collaboratively with the government to make sure that this is really good legislation. I guess the other thing I'd add, though, is that there are things that we would want any new government to do that they can do outside of legislation, that they can do within their remit in terms of investing resources. We've talked a bit about tree planting and vegetation and so on today, but as part of our election platform this time, we've put forward a range of different initiatives, which I'd encourage people, if you have an interest, to have a look at our website. A range of different initiatives that would create new jobs but are also good for the environment. And there's a whole range of those that are in the realm of conservation jobs and around improving vegetation, tree planting. We've set targets for planting 2 million more trees over the next 10 years, something we think that is absolutely doable, but again, it requires government investment to make those things happen. And so the legislative work, absolutely, we'd like to work with the Labor Party if they're in government, or future government, to deal with that, but we'd also be lobbying whoever is in government to put some real money on the table to get some of these things happening at a departmental level as well. And obviously working very closely with you, Craig, and your organisations to get a sense of the key things that are priorities for you as well.
Great. Now, conscious of the time, and there's a series of questions I still want to ask before opening up to the floor. So we might need to pick up the pace, and partly for me, also. Really keen to talk about transport, even though, Susan, it's not your direct ministerial sort of area, but essential to, as we know, it is the fastest growing and the largest component of our greenhouse gas emissions. And yet there is a woeful lack of true investment in active transport, be it walking or cycling, or public transport, to ensure that we actually create that shift away from private vehicles. We've actually, in our election process, we actually suggested that we should actually scrap the North-South corridor extension because that is going to be such a massive opportunity cost, a massive suck of all the transport dollars over the next few years from the feds in particular, and actually turn it back into better transport options. There have been a series of questions which have come through from the crowd about what your plan is to decarbonise our transport network, and they say in brackets, electric vehicles are not an acceptable answer. So I think they're wanting beyond electric vehicles. And how are you going to get DIT to follow your plan, given they are evidently ignoring the current government's climate change action plan with transport solutions that rely almost exclusively on building more and bigger roads? So really keen for cycling vision, walking vision, public transport. What's going to make a difference, and how quickly can we do it? So maybe Robert first, yeah.
Thanks, Craig. Look, I'm really pleased you've asked this question, because I don't think it's had enough focus during the election campaign in terms of transport policy. I mentioned before that there's a few things we've got on the table in terms of ideas that we'd love to see a future government take up. One of those is making public transport free. We can easily do this, and that would have an immediate effect in terms of reducing congestion on our roads, reducing carbon emissions. It's also a social justice initiative because it would help provide pathways for people to move around. But we're also campaigning for $1 billion to be invested in public transport infrastructure to bring it up to scratch, recognising that there are lots of areas that have been neglected. Another thing that we've been campaigning for this election is a passenger rail system, a network going up to Mount Barker and the Adelaide Hills. Anyone who's spent time up there knows that transport infrastructure is a huge issue in that area. It's a symptom of inadequate planning, but we do already have a rail network in place. It's just not being activated. And there are lots of players that have come forward and said we could do a trial, let's make it happen, and yet the government for some reason are refusing to even investigate it. So we'll be lobbying very hard to make that a priority of any future government, because we think people in Mount Barker and the Adelaide Hills have a right to be able to get around and be able to access the community. But also we recognise it's a really good environmental initiative. Cycling infrastructure, again, I've seen no discussion of that from the two major parties during this election, and I think that's a real shame. I talked before about our push to say $20 million to invest in cycling infrastructure so that we have a decent network that runs across the state. But I think we also need to do some work around breaking this dichotomy between drivers and cyclists. It's an issue I've become really aware of when I was on the Adelaide City Council, where you had this bizarre situation where the government actually put some money on the table, I believe it was the Labor government initially, to build the east-west bikeway in the city, and yet the City Council could not find a place to put the bike network that didn't upset one or two businesses, and didn't proceed with it. And we're even going to, talk about the money being handed back if it wasn't spent. I mean, that's just embarrassing. So another issue that we've put on the agenda this election is the idea of setting up a walking and cycling commissioner, similar to the model that they have in the United Kingdom. Somebody who is independent of government, who could advocate for best practice, and really be an advocate for policy changes on this level. So there are a few things that are on our radar and that we'll continue to push in the next Parliament. But for me, I think when we're talking about the climate crisis, transport policy is really, really vital. And this obsession with roads and road infrastructure at the expense of everything else, I think is doing us a real disservice and is holding us back in terms of reducing our emissions.
So you're right, this is slightly out of my immediate policy knowledge, so I was just doing a little cheek check of what it was, the name of one of them. So Labor's committed to having a guide for pedestrian cycling and public transport and open space connectivity guide, see I didn't even remember it after that, for all of the rail and road projects, so that they must be guided by such the expectations that are laid out. That we have committed will be consulted on and completed in the 22-23 year. So I imagine there'll be a number of people who would want to participate in that. We do, of course, have the history of having electrified some of our train networks, and we look forward to one day having a federal Labor government that might be prepared to help us electrify some more. We're going to have the Port Rail Spur that was contracted by us, cancelled by the government after spending $6 million, the Liberal government after spending $6 million on it. We will be doing that, which gives another whole part of of Adelaide having access to the train line, and it also, of course, helps reinvigorate Port Adelaide as a heritage area. I've been told not to talk about EVs, but I was really interested in the survey that we filled out, which took hours.
I said the same thing, Susan. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I got another letter today.
And now it's come back
no.
again with, can you sign it, please? I'm like, what, in blood? Anyway, in the EV section, you didn't say repeal the tax. I was a bit surprised as that wasn't one of the suggestions, but we're going to bloody repeal it. Yeah, I think it was implied, maybe. But I was very interested sitting in the same panel as Chris Bowen recently, who talked a lot about his ambition and his commitments, should they win the election, to a lot of money spent on community batteries, so a separate issue, but I was excited by that, but also even more charging infrastructure and a whole lot of incentives. So that pleased me, because that sort of helps that partnership. It's really hard to do things always alone in state government.
All right, so I've got 4 questions, and we've got about 4 minutes before I want to open it up. So a minute per response. No pressure. All right, first one is the Pastoral Act and Rangelands Protection. So we've had a...
will not support the Pastoral Act that the Liberals suggested. In no way, no how. No.
That was a dreadful idea. Well done for everyone who stood up and said that was a dreadful idea. We will not support it. We will make sure that this nonsense that there can't be conservation land in the rangelands is addressed. I don't think it really can be a legislative problem, but if it is, we might have to make a minor adjustment. We'll also bring the pastoral unit back to the Environment Department, and we'll add $1 million, and that one I forgot, $1 million to help them do the assessments, because I think part of the problem has been that there's been a backlog of assessments, so the 42 years has seemed to come up much more quickly than the 14-year cycle.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And look, we won't support the Liberal bill either. So it sounds like we can get the numbers between us. That's good.
Right.
Knock that off.
Great. Next one, duck and quail hunting. So it's been a long-running issue for many people in the room. We still are one of just 2 states in Australia that allow the shooting for recreation of native ducks and quails. What is your party going to do about it?
We don't support duck or quail hunting. And can I say, one thing we must surely have learned over this pandemic, over the last few years, is we have got to strike a better balance with the natural world. That's surely the lesson for all of us. And so, exploiting animals, treating animals in an inhumane way, that's got to be a thing of the past. So, yeah, we want to get rid of those practices.
I speak as someone who has been down to Bull Lagoon picking up dead and dying ducks many, many years ago. Our policy is to conduct a review into duck hunting and quail hunting. It was our policy going into the election, and I believe I believe it was the Liberal policy, but they then didn't do it. We will actually do it. Thank
you. Next one is actually a question which, once I read it out, you'll realise who it comes from. It's to Susan. If you are Minister for the Environment after the election, will you require a phase out of BHP Olympic Dam water extraction from the Gab, causing adverse impacts on unique and fragile mountain springs of ongoing significant cultural value to the Aboriginal people? And of course, that's a David Noonan question.
I looked over.
I've had conversations actually with SACOM, the Council for Mining and Energy, about the Gab. They know that their social licence days are limited. It's a question of time and how they deal with that. So don't take from this, yes, we're going to turn off the tap, but do take from this a recognition that times are changing and that there are ongoing discussions about how that occurs.
Wonderful. And the last one before we open up for audience questions is about the proposal to ship intermediate level waste from Lucas Heights across to South Australia and create a federal government-led waste facility. Keen to get your party's views on the current process and what you would do if you were got into Parliament to respond to it.
Well, the first thing I'd say, and this won't surprise anyone here, of course, the Greens don't support the nuclear waste dump at Kimber, and we think the process that's been adopted has been really outrageous in terms of ignoring the views of the traditional owners, and I think also thumbing the nose up to the views of South Australians more broadly. I don't think South Australians want to see our state become a nuclear waste dump, so we're absolutely opposed to that, and we'll do everything we can in the Parliament to defeat it. Might I say, in the last parliamentary session in the Upper House, I moved a motion calling on the national government to abandon the nuclear waste dump in Kimber and condemning it. And the Labor Party supported that motion. But sadly, the Liberals opposed it, and the SA Best Party opposed it, along with John Darley. And so when we talk about the importance of the Upper House and who we consider, that's a really good example, because it meant that the motion went down, and the opportunity to send a really clear message to Canberra in the lead up to the federal election was lost. Certainly after the election, I'll continue to push that issue. But I am very concerned about what might happen in the Upper House if the SA Best Party win the balance of power in their own right and elect a member this cycle, because they're now on the public record supporting the nuclear waste dump. And I'm very worried about what might happen if One Nation are a player in the Upper House as well, given their position around nuclear waste and other issues. So we've got to think really carefully about who forms government, but also who we have in the Upper House come March 19.
Yeah, Labor in South Australia has opposed the Kimber dump on the grounds of unseemly haste and dreadful process. Of course, we as a country have some nuclear waste and we need to deal with it. It's been dressed up as being of utmost urgency, and as I understand it from people like Dave Sweeney and others, it's not. And so what we need to do is have a carefully considered national plan for management of waste, rather than let's pretend this is temporary and then just put a shed and put some in, which is pretty close to understand what it's going to be. But the other objection we have is that we believe that traditional owners should have the right of veto, and we've been clear about that all along.
Wonderful. All right, now it's over to you. So if you've got a question for the candidates, please head across to the microphone, and we'll take them one by one. We've got about half an hour, so hopefully we're going to get through quite a few. And really encourage you to keep them short and sweet, and avoid statements if you can, but in order to maximise time for responses. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elise Mickey. I'm the lead Upper House candidate in the state election for SA Party, which is the Sustainable Australia Party. You've touched on basically the development problem, the planning problems we have in South Australia. I really want to congratulate Conservation Council and the contributors for making such a great candidate survey in which SA Party agreed to every single point. Back to planning, basically we've got this new and improved planning system. It contains inadequate notification requirements and potential biases from the State Commission Assessment Panel. So to protect our environment and our heritage assets, would you, as elected representatives, consider amending the local planning laws to include a requirement for submissions to be assessed by community-led citizen juries, because such juries would provide a tangible method to give power back to the people?
Really interesting question. Look, we in the Greens, and I've explained this a bit tonight, are really supportive of the community being more involved in planning decisions. And we absolutely want to ensure that local councils have a seat at the table, that there are more opportunities for the community to be directly engaged. Whether or not a citizens' jury is the best way to do that, to be honest, I have an open mind and I'm open to talking about that further, but that's not something that's in our policy at the moment. But absolutely having the community engaged and having their say is fundamental. It could be that that's the best way to do it. Be interested in looking at what happens in other jurisdictions.
Thank you.
I think I've already spoken about policy, so yeah, take it on board.
Thank you.
John Coulter. Every major environmental report on sustainability, whether locally, Australia-wide or globally, has said that from a sustainability point of view, humanity is going backwards. We are on the wrong path. Every one of those reports has pointed to two things as the fundamental drivers of our unsustainability. One is population growth, continued population growth, and the other one is continual drive for more and more economic growth. Now, Susan has mentioned population growth tonight as though it is inevitable. 60 to 70% of Australians at the present time in repeated polls said they do not want a larger population. The Liberal government has said that it wants Adelaide to grow to 2 million. What will that do for our environment? What is your position on both population growth and economic growth?
Hi, John. Thanks for your question. Look, it's really interesting when I hear the government talk about population, and there was a big push around this recently, I think led by the Committee of Adelaide, setting goals for population. What they often don't talk about is the appropriate infrastructure and the resources that need to be associated with that. And we mentioned before about Mount Barker and what can happen when you create a suburb and you don't put in place the appropriate infrastructure and the supports. So look, I think for us in the Greens, we believe that we've got to actually plan appropriately for these things and make sure that if we're going to see population increase over time, that there is a consideration for what that means for resources. I think we also have to recognise, in terms of the question around economic growth, this idea that our economy needs to keep on getting bigger and bigger and we need to see more development and more industry and so on, that's not sustainable long term. And we've seen over the last 20 and 30 years the narrative that a rising tide lifts all boats isn't necessarily true. The benefits of economic growth are not distributed more broadly. So we need to think about that as well. But look, ultimately, we all need to live in balance with the natural world, and we need to ensure we get the right balance. It's clear we haven't got that right at the moment as a global community.
Yeah, so when I talk about population growth, I'm just recognising reality. People have babies, people are living longer, which is a marvellous feature of our increased sanitation, diet and health system in Australia. So the reality is that our population drifts up gently. If population grows through migration, those people live somewhere. And so if we talk globally, unless we're talking about population controls, I think we have to acknowledge that our population as a planet is going up, and there's an inertia built into that that makes it impossible not to hit very high number very quickly. So I've always been more interested in the impact of a person. So a person who lives a high carbon Western lifestyle has a much greater impact than a person who lives a zero carbon, very sustainable, within ecologically sustainable development principles life. And so I'm interested in how we transition that to that. And similarly with economic growth, I don't even really know what we mean by it. We've, in some ways, I think in the left, in the environment movement, we've demonised it because we see it as this great engine of consumption, and I understand why, therefore, we're concerned about it. But actually, again, if what we're talking about is growth based on zero carbon, growth based on the environment not being harmed, then what we might be talking about is creating resources that mean that everybody gets a chance at living a decent life. Now that may sound Pollyanna, but so too does the idea that we won't have a growing population. So this is the dilemma we all face in this century. So how do we do this together? And absolutist answers don't tend to be particularly helpful in creating policy.
John, I was a question for Susan. It's well outside your portfolio.
Do you mind, sorry, just so I can hear, do you mind, thank you.
Yes. Thanks, John. Yes, the question is within the energy area. One of the proposals by the ALP is to have a hydrogen-powered thermal power station.
Yes.
Now, that idea just makes no sense because of the very low energy conversion by using hydrogen in the same way you'd use coal, because you have an energy conversion efficiency of maybe 30 or 40%. Whereas we already have other technologies like batteries, large-scale batteries which we've already got here, which we could replicate, and or to use pumped hydro.
So this is possibly a longer and more detailed conversation we've got time for tonight. But my understanding is that batteries are extremely useful for stabilising the system and for the grid system, and for that short interaction of pushing energy when required. Batteries at this stage are not suitable for guaranteeing baseload power. And what we need is a way to harness the electricity that's capable of being produced when it's windy and sunny in a way that can be held and produced and sent into the system when that is useful. Hydrogen is one way of doing that. And if you're doing it from spillover of excess availability, then you're doing it from a very green source, unlike most of the world, unlike the other states that are rushing to hydrogen. Hydrogen is a fuel that, as I understand it, is desperately desired by other countries, but they want it to be green. If we can create this, and it will take time, but if we can create this as an industry where we're capable of producing green hydrogen, liquefying and sending it overseas, then we have the possibility of that future of an economy that is based on a zero carbon technology. But any more detail, you probably want to talk to Thankyous and Torrens, or we can talk separately because I think it's going to get into too much detail.
Believe me, I have tried to talk to Tom.
Hi, Linda Yates. PIRSA, on behalf of the Minister for Primary Industries, not the Minister for the Environment, revoked what had been a 30-year spearfishing ban along the Metropolitan Coast only a couple of weeks ago, with very little apparent consultation, as most locals didn't know anything about it. And the Minister for the Environment seems to have supported this, or at least he hasn't said anything against it. So as a prospective Minister for the Environment, would you be interested in overturning that and returning the Metropolitan Coast to banning spearfishing? Because currently at Merino Rocks we're getting huge numbers of spearfishers and it's not sustainable. So.
Yeah, no, I'm sympathetic. I heard the interaction on the radio the other day. That was the first I'd heard they were proposing to do it in my electorate for the 100 metres south of the Outer Harbour barrier.
Yeah,
when we had a chat to the surf club, that's the Surf Lifesaving Club that's right there, they knew nothing about it either. So I'm very concerned from the process perspective, and should we be in government, it'll be one of the early items. It's been difficult in the noise of these last 2 weeks of the election to get any cut through, but a few of us on my side have been talking about our concerns about the impact. That said, we haven't talked to the spearfishers. We haven't understood, what their case has been, but
I think it's based on an economic argument.
It's worrying,
very cleverly.
yeah, well, it's worrying to me that the government thought that it wasn't something they wanted to talk to my local community about before they introduced, so they might not have liked the answer they got. So we will definitely be looking at it should we get in.
Because I think the economy will be improved by having snorkelers and swimmers and family groups ready to go down to the local beach and not see people spearing fish. So, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jim Bastiris. I have a question for David Spitner. I think the Liberal Party have a very recreational approach to protecting the River Torrens, for example, all the while giving a procedural nod to a mine expansion that's happening in the Leigh Creek catchment. A mine expansion which is quarrying material which is readily available elsewhere in the state from, say, low rainfall areas, which speaks to your point, Susan, about not needing to turn a tap off. I'm wondering what your position, Susan, is about mine expansions in the Torrens catchment.
Yeah, so I have had a meeting with some people from the White Rock, the community around it. Wasn't as long as a year ago, and it was with you. Okay. Thinking you look familiar. Excellent. And at that time you were talking about trying to come to an accommodation, I think, where it was the excessive expansion that you were particularly concerned about and the impact on the local community. So I don't know where that's gone since. So you and I need to talk afterwards. Obviously this is Tom's portfolio, but I was taking an interest because I was concerned. But you were right to state this is an example of the local community saying, actually, this isn't great, we want to do something better. So perhaps I need to catch up with the detail of that and see where Tom is on it. But you were an impressive community group when I met you back then, so I hope you've been having some success.
Hasn't been going too bad.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Can I just add, we've spoken about this before, Jim, but just for the benefit of people here, one of the big concerns around private mines that we have in the Greens is that these mines aren't bound by the same rules as other mines. That's a real concern. And I have a private members bill before the Parliament, which I will introduce again after the next election, to bring the consultation requirements of private mines into line with the requirements of other mines to ensure that there's due regard for the environment, community health, cultural impact as well. So that's something tangible that we could do. But I think there's also a broader question around, is it appropriate to have private mines in residential areas that are in effect devouring our landscape? And these are kind of an old hangover of the previous system that was in existence years and years ago. So we've really got to look at what role they play and whether they should continue to be part of the landscape. So something we're keen to definitely keep looking at and talking to any future government about.
Rob Fowler. I'm going to follow up on John Coulter's theme. Just to make an observation first, the population growth in Australia is not the product of natural increase, it's the product of the number of people that we bring to the country. And that's another conversation. But I actually want to ask you a question as to whether Labor and the Greens would be willing to consider, in terms of economic growth, the idea of instructing Treasury to produce an alternative set of indicators based on what's called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And by way of explanation, I'm a member of something called the Wakefield Futures Group, which you won't have heard very much about, but it includes Professor Ian Lowe, Robert Costanza, Julian Cribb, and there's about 8 or 9 of us. We've just relocated our operations to South Australia. And before the last state election, we worked with Ian Hunter, who funded a project to get Dr. Philip Rawn from South Australia to prepare a set of numbers for South Australia. And we were close to getting Treasury to be, we were close to having a conversation with Treasury about producing those alternative sets of numbers, which are different from GDP, which just simply measures goods and bads. And that conversation went no further after the state election. So my question is, would you be willing to consider that? Because we'd be very willing to assist, both, for example, giving examples of where this has been legislated in other parts of the world.
Yeah, look, I must be honest and say I haven't heard of that model before, so I'd be interested in having a chat with you about that afterwards. And you know, certainly I accept the premise that we must have a better way of measuring these things. So yeah, let's have
It's
a
a
chat.
wellbeing measure that has about 25 or 26 different criteria. They include the value of unpaid work by women, a whole range of other things that might appear.
Certainly a better system than the one we have. Yeah.
And in fact, I not only have heard of it, but back when we worked together in the Office for Sustainability 20 years ago, that was one of the issues that we were looking at, was whether there are other ways of producing an assessment of how we're going. I think we probably answered no in the submission.
You did.
And I think it's not that I'm not interested, it's that I want to know to what end. So it's very nice to produce a report that says we're undervaluing the work that women do by X amount, and the impact, we're eating into the capital of our natural environment, both of which will be true. What I really would like to get my head around is, so what then? Is it about educating the public and making them have different expectations? Is there a way for that to have a feedback into the way that the departments operate? So I'm happy to continue to have the conversation, but I was a little sceptical back in the Office of Sustainability days about how receptive what you want to change those institutions would be. 20 years on, maybe they're more receptive. But yeah, let's continue to have that discussion.
Whatever happened to the Office of Sustainability? Wouldn't it be nice to have the one back again?
Yeah, well, it was still going when we left, and then it fell into a heap.
Yeah. And just conscious of time, so we might have to leave this as the last question. The last one more. All right, so I've got 4 questions to go. All right, thank you. No worries, Barbara. We'll get to you as well.
Hi, I'm Katie from Back Adelaide. I just heard you say that transport's not in your department, and I just wanted to ask 2 questions. One, firstly, in whose department do transport emissions sit? And as the Environment Minister, if you were elected, would you be willing to meet with transport groups like AS so that we could talk to you about the mechanisms within the Transport Department and how they currently don't support investment into sustainable transport infrastructure?
Yeah. So obviously I'm sure you're aware that the transport itself sits in the Department of Infrastructure and Transport, and that's Tom Coutts-Tonnis's portfolio. It is interesting when any minister's got the title of climate change, what is it that they ought to be directly in control of, and what is it that they ought to be facilitating conversations across, because climate change is actually everything. So one of the things I've been thinking about, and this isn't an announcement, this isn't a commitment, this is, I'm thinking that this might be a good idea, is a climate change cabinet committee. Because my mind is turning, although I've got no idea if we're going to win the election, I just don't want to be surprised if we do. I want to be ready. One of the things I've been thinking about is how do we operationalise some of the ambitions and plans that we've got. And the virtue of a cabinet committee is it then requires work at the next level, of the chief executive level, that's to serve that committee. So I think it might be one of the mechanisms, but a direct answer, yes, of course, I'd be delighted to meet, of course.
Hello, I'm Naomi, representing the Australian Association for Environmental Education in SA. And this question is to you, Susan Moore, as the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party. In leading the government and in your role as Environment Minister, how will you, together obviously with the Education Minister, invest in preparing our young people for the reality of life in a climate crisis and for a rapid transition to a sustainable future? And will you support the revitalisation of the Australian Sustainable Schools Initiative?
Yeah, I like the Sustainable Schools Initiative, and I'm very happy to talk to Blair Boyer about that. Your question before that, though, is huge. How do we teach our children to live in the society that is now and is coming? That's hours of conversation. The Education Department, I was the Minister for 3 years, as you may well know, does an extraordinary job. The schools do an extraordinary job. The teachers are very good at teaching students about what's going on in the world, and they are extraordinarily interested in how we have a healthy planet, the kids. But what exactly do they need to be equipped with in terms of skills and in terms of knowledge is something that we are still sort of running to catch up with. critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and an understanding of how ecology works are obviously crucial, and all of those are taught. But I suspect that we need to be doing more, but it is not a light question. The world that's coming is dramatically different from the one I grew up in. I worry for children. I worry for my kids, everyone's kids, the next generation, the one after that, because none of the indicators are going in the right way at the moment for biodiversity and for climate. So, yeah, I'd like to have a longer and deeper discussion, because I don't think it's a trivial matter of setting up a program and having something in the curriculum. I think and I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying, I'm just saying my answer can't be glib, because it's a really big question.
My name's Michael Cornish. Good to see the Labor announcement on Heritage Agreement funding. It's excellent. I'm really not sure why the Libs haven't come out with any announcement yet. That's rather bizarre. But especially since they've revitalised it, you know. But does Labor have any plans to actively expand SA's privately protected area estate beyond the Heritage Agreement funding for existing Heritage Agreement properties?
I'm interested to know when there are opportunities coming up, but we haven't set aside any particular funding. And I will just say that the revitalisation by the government of the Heritage Agreement funding was done because Mark Parnell and I blocked the landscapes bill in the upper house, and that was part of the deal to get it through. So, and it was Mark's suggestion, and it was, I think, as a result of a lot of lobbying that occurred from, so I'm not trying to take credit for it, but I'm certainly not going to say that it's okay for the Minister to take credit for it the way he has on the radio. And he did it for a short period of time, and the money's going to run out. So that's why I wanted to put more money in.
And it's Barbara, do you have a question?
Thanks. Can I take it too, or are you?
Thanks, Andy.
When Mr. Rao changed the planning laws, it's resulted in an increase in urban infill. So people are living a lot closer proximity to each other. Yet the laws to safeguard residents' peaceful enjoyment of their property are inadequate. Example is it's okay to bang a drum any time of the day or night, 7 days a week, if it's considered to be music. The legislation excludes music as being a nuisance. So under the current Local Litter and Nuisance Control Act, that is one example of totally being inadequate when that's happening in the community. And if you're elected, how will you change the Act so it reflects what's happening now that people are in this closer living quarters?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an easy answer for that, because I thought that I could complain about my neighbours playing music after a certain time at night, and that the police would go around. I feel like, has that changed? I feel like I've done that in the last, as a bit of a wowser, I think I've done that. So obviously I don't know enough, and I apologise for not knowing enough, and I will take that on board and also discuss it with the Planning Shadow Minister. I don't mean in any way to trivialise it. The impact of noise from, as you say, increasing density is an issue that deserves attention. I had no idea that music was somehow exempt.
Yeah, that's news to me too. I didn't know that either, but I do know that I think it's through the EPA system that you can make a complaint around noise, or there's a different, it's through local councils, is it? I know when I was a City of Adelaide councillor, I often had residents raising with me noise issues, and it was incredibly difficult to be able to get a resolution for them. You know, you send around a noise inspector, it doesn't happen to be operating at that time, you then get told, oh, there's no issues at this particular period. And we all know often when you're talking about street noise and so on, things can happen at different times. So my view would be we do need to look at that and work out a better system that addresses the sorts of things that you're talking about. I don't have an easy answer for it, but it's clear the current regime isn't fit for purpose or working.
The system is now under local government, so the council, an authorised officer is an employee that works 9 to 5. So if you've got this happening weekends, public holidays, 7 in the morning, or midnight, they don't respond. The police, if you ring them, so ring the council.
Yes.
and you just get the run around and nothing kind of happens. Yeah, and then the inspector comes and they don't pick up the noise or yeah.
Conscious we have come to the end of our time. Might just hand it over just for a quick 1 minute to just final concluding statements, last messages, last thoughts, anything you've missed out. Please just, what would you say to this audience of potential voters heading towards March 19?
Yeah.
I just said vote early, vote often. I was being very flippant. I apologise.
Look, thanks everybody for coming along tonight. I think it's been a good discussion. We've dealt with a range of different issues. I guess my final pitch would be to think carefully about your upper house vote. As I said at the start of our session tonight, the Greens aren't going to be in government, but we do have an opportunity to hold the balance of power in the upper house in our own right, and that would really put us in the box seat in terms of being able to push for strong and effective action on the climate crisis and to push the next government to ensure that environmental protection is front and centre. So certainly, if I'm returned to the Parliament and if I have my running mate Yasha join me, then I think we'd be in a real position to positively influence the next government, whether that be the Labor Party or the Liberal Party. And so we'd certainly urge you to keep that in your minds when you go to vote in a few weeks' time.
I think I've said enough in terms of what our policies are and aren't. I would urge you just to keep this level of activism and more. It does make a difference. You don't win everything and you don't change every decision maker's mind, but we would be so much worse off as a state if we didn't have the Conservation Council and if we didn't have the activism that's represented here. And as I said at the beginning, I want voices to be heard, even if occasionally I'm going to disappoint or I'm going to disagree, as has happened tonight. So should I be fortunate enough to fulfil a lifelong dream of being the Environment Minister in South Australia, I want this to be as it is and more.
Fantastic. Please put your hands together for 2 candidates. It has been a great discussion, really appreciate it, and clearly you're both on top of your portfolios, and that's really welcome sign. So thank you for that. We've got a small gift for each of you, which is your Climate Action Now pack. Face masks, t-shirts, signs, stickers. Please, everyone else in the audience, you can grab your own pack as well. One for me. One for the Minister. So please go over there and grab your own pack. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight. I hope it's been a useful conversation, and let's keep fighting, as Susan said.